If you forced me to name a favorite video game of all time, it would be tough, but more often than not, I think I'd say Ratchet & Clank Up Your Arsenal. This, perhaps more than any other, is the game of my childhood, a title that I've beaten well over 100 full times. In fact, there were times when I would come home from school, my homework already done for the day, and I would sit down and complete a full playthrough before I went to sleep that night. A game that took the explosive stakes of its predecessor and ramped up the intensity even more with sprawling battlefields, a complete story with more on the line, and a menacing, all-time great villain. Every single thing that Ratchet & Clank 3 did, I loved. As a kid. But when I look at Ratchet 3 today, do I still feel the same way? Are all the things that the younger me adored the same things that I seek out with a Ratchet game 15 years later with a different perspective? Or, in Insomniac's pursuit of perfecting their ultimate vision for this trilogy, did they maybe push a bit too close to the sun this time, losing some of what made the first two games tick and shifting towards level designs and styles that I actually didn't care much for in future titles? And after dozens of hours of research and conducting interviews with some of this game's developers, speaking on their time with this culmination of the Ratchet trilogy, uncovering previously unreleased info about its cut content and development issues, can I today reconcile my love and nostalgia for this game with the sky-high expectations and heavy workload of making 3 full titles in 3 years? A pressure that drove so many Insomniac employees to leave within a few years of this game's release. This is often considered the best game in the Ratchet & Clank franchise, and as I said, it's probably my most coveted game of all time. But as we've gone through already with the first 2 games, I don't make exceptions. We're going to break down this game and its rocky development and put it back together again, raising it up and letting the light shine even on those dark crevices. This is Ratchet & Clank 3, Up Your Arsenal. The story of Ratchet & Clank 3 begins in much the same way that the development story behind the game does. After saving 2 galaxies in 2 years, our heroes are, well, heroes. They're celebrities. They're full-blown household names. Ratchet is enjoying the high life in the duo's megacorp apartment, while Clank's a movie and holovision star now, which is pretty cool, donning a suit and fighting criminal masterminds on screen as Secret Agent Clank. And the fame certainly hasn't gone to the sidekick's head at all.
Bring the car around, Jeeves. That was terrific.
Yeah, great. Change the channel.
But the man said to stay tuned.
When Ratchet flips the channel, he finds that his old home planet Veldin is under attack by an alien Tyrannoid army under the command of the evil and mysterious Dr. Nefarious. Now, hopefully the real world doesn't have a Dr. Nefarious or an alien invasion, although I wouldn't complain about a Secret Agent Clank TV show. Behind the scenes, a third Ratchet & Clank game was a foregone conclusion well before the second game was even finished, and Insomniac was enjoying the limelight as one of the foremost and most respected studios in the entire gaming industry. Going Commando had been developed in less than a year, a game that was 150% larger than the original according to Insomniac, and as pre-production began on what would become Ratchet 3, an outline was crafted for a game that would be 150% larger than that. The studio's upper brass seemed to know before Going Commando's release that it would be their highest rated game to date, and they were already itching to top it. So Insomniac underwent another hiring spree, now reaching nearly 120 developers that would be dedicated to just this project. All the while, a smaller, separate team was already designing ahead for what would 3 years later become the PlayStation 3 launch title Resistance: Fall of Man, having to stab in the dark and guess what that system's hardware specs would even look like. And in the background, work also began on an in-house level designing tool to facilitate better coordination between level designers and programmers in the future. Many of these new hires, some fresh out of college, were huge fans of the first Ratchet & Clank game, brought in to work on Ratchet 3 before 2 had even been released, or at least before they could have a chance to play that game for themselves. But what does a game 150% larger than the already massive Ratchet & Clank 2 even look like? Well, to start, Up Your Arsenal technically wasn't a one-team project, it was two, because early on it was decided that Ratchet 3 would be Insomniac's first online game, featuring a full multiplayer mode that Sony could use to market the new PlayStation 2 broadband adapter for the original PS2 model, as well as the new Slim PS2 that included broadband support natively. With none of Ratchet 3's systems in place yet, the multiplayer was developed separately from the main campaign using weapons from the first two games and later roped back into the main concoction. And that multiplayer also needed to work both with 4-player split-screen offline as well as 2-player split-screen online gameplay, which required a complete rework of just about everything that Insomniac had ever done. Additionally, following Insomniac's narrative struggles in the first two games, the studio brought on its first dedicated writer, Brad Santos, to weave a wider, more cohesive, and more coherent tale that would pay equal respect to the first two games while wrapping up this trilogy. And feeling like there was little left to do in the Bogon Galaxy, Insomniac, like our heroes, decided that it was time to come back home, to revisit many levels from Ratchet 1 and build a larger world, a larger universe from which this series could expand in later games. A game that was only slated to have about an hour of cinematics and cutscenes lining up with the first two games, Up Your Arsenal actually ended up with over 100 minutes of these cutscenes, biting off far more than initially intended thanks to a far more involved script. Incidentally, biting off more than intended as far as animation goes is kind of an Insomniac staple at this point, with the studio frequently underestimating how much time, effort, and money the cutscene work will take, which can sometimes lead to a little bit of corner cutting. Now, to reiterate, this team in 3 years had tripled in size from 40 to 120 plus, having made 2 games in back-to-back years. It was now working on 2 more games simultaneously, one on next-gen hardware that hadn't yet been finalized, and the other a 2-team project itself featuring the completely untested water of PS2 multiplayer. And despite Ratchet 2 already cutting it pretty close to the deadline, Insomniac yet again only gave itself 1 year to make an even larger game whose scope continued to increase even midway through production. Full steam ahead is a massive understatement. It might even be a bit weak to describe this project's goals as insane, and that's not me editorializing. Insomniac's chief creative officer Brian Hastings said as much in this game's post-mortem, saying, "We knew we were taking on the most ambitious project we had ever attempted, and we began to think we had bitten off a little too much this time around." And yet, when Up Your Arsenal somehow released a week ahead of schedule, it blew away everybody. Ratchet 3 to this day is Insomniac's highest rated game thanks to all of that dedicated work, thanks to having a designated story writer so that the writing didn't take a rushed backseat to the more important stuff, thanks to the incredible suite of features, larger battlefields, more vehicles, its array of side characters, thanks to Insomniac's hiring of a dozen more QA testers, thanks to an unprecedented 9 playtests and focus tests, and thanks to the united efforts of everybody at the studio determined to get this game right no matter what it took. Also known as crunch. That's not my word choice, that is again Brian Hastings. According to his post-mortem, the animation team crunched to finish the much more packed 100 minutes of cinematics because everybody had underestimated the screenplay and nobody timed everything out. The new hires were effectively crunched in their training process and thrown right into the fire because Up Your Arsenal quickly fell behind schedule, and because of that, Insomniac later outsourced the multiplayer's entire lobby system to another studio because they had kept putting that off to work on more important features, and that part is because Insomniac dedicated just one programmer at first to work on the multiplayer, who they then pulled off of the online for a bit to help make sure that going Commando didn't get delayed. You're probably noticing a bit of a pattern here. This game was a lot, and even a few weeks before it went gold, just like so many games before and since throughout the industry, nobody inside the studio was really sure whether it would all come together or if it would be an absolute unmitigated disaster. I've spoken to a number of developers that worked on Ratchet & Clank 3 about their time on the project. Some programmers, some designers, each with a wholly unique experience that I'll share with you in their own words to the best of my ability. What I can say right now in my own words based on these interviews as well as the rest of my research and more importantly by playing this game for the 100-something time is that I don't look at, again, probably my favorite game ever the same way anymore. But that's not because of comments or allegations of crunch. It's not because Insomniac is secretly some evil corporation. To the contrary, it seems clear to me based on my research on this project as well as future games in this series that they've learned so many lessons thanks to these early Ratchet projects and that today they likely take better care of their employees than most of the rest of this industry. If they didn't, we would probably know by now. The reason I think my opinion on this game has shifted a bit is because thanks to this pursuit of bigger, better, and more, and because everybody was so fully invested in making this project work, even if it meant staying late or cutting some optional content or any number of compromises, nobody really had the chance to step back and wonder if it was all the right kind of more. Even as a kid, it was unfathomable to me that this game could be made in a year, and that's because it was an unfathomable feat. But playing it as an adult, as much as I love the story, as much as I love the weapons and the upgrades and all of the rest of the things that we'll be digging into, it starts to homogenize. We lose many of the branching pathways that planets would give you. We lose the platforming or puzzle sections that broke up the combat, because platforming was a bit of a dirty word in the mid-2000s. And although I loved the insanely polished gameplay and combat, I think Insomniac took Up Your Arsenal a little too much in that direction. Unlike with my retrospectives on Ratchet & Clank 1 and 2, I can't walk you down memory lane planet by planet, interweaving discussion of new mechanics with analysis of the level design and story beats, because almost every level is a linear combat encounter, and almost every mechanic is just taken wholesale from 2 and improved a little bit here or there. Many of the things that I would praise in this game, I already did in Going Commando. So instead, we'll work through this game's fantastic story, mostly planet by planet as I've done before, and we'll talk about the journey that led to this game coming together against all odds. We'll talk about those compromises that were made to get to what's considered the pinnacle of this franchise, and we'll talk about why I've started to look at it a bit differently today. When Ratchet & Clank land on Veldin, our heroes meet the new Galactic Rangers, an elite group of robot troopers currently tasked with stopping the Tyrannoid invaders. Okay, new might be a bit of a stretch. It turns out they've been around for a while and were just nowhere to be found during the events of Ratchet 1.
Hey, look! It's a new sergeant!
Huh?
Hey, Sarge, you can have my gun. There's too many of them! We're all gonna die!
Also, elite may have been a stretch as well. I guess Ratchet is just their commanding officer now. But whatever, they gave us 2 guns, so I'll consider it an enlistment bonus of sorts. One of the things you'll quickly discover in Up Your Arsenal is that these Tyrannoids make up the majority of the game's enemies, a contrast from the first 2 games where most planets had their own unique creatures for Ratchet & Clank to fight. This was part of a dual effort to tie the story together with a unifying foe, an evolution of the Thugs for Less in Going Commando, as well as a way to save time and resources that could be better spent on other features instead of designing enemies that you would only see once. Even as it was, a few Tyrannoid enemy designs were already cut due to a lack of resources. Throughout the game, we'll see 4 different ranks of these aliens, with their strength indicated by their size as well as their number of eyes. Unintentional rhyme there. The little one-eyed grunts will only take maybe a wrench hit or 2, while the 4-eyed generals will need a lot more firepower. And more firepower is Up Your Arsenal's specialty, as the name would imply. Although there are actually fewer weapons here than in Going Commando, 20 compared to 24, every weapon in Ratchet 3 can be upgraded to level 5 instead of just once. We start out on Veldin with the Shock Blaster shotgun as well as the Nitro Launcher bomb launcher. I gotta be better with my script today. And the game takes no time at all giving you access to more weapons. By level 2, we'll already have a third of the weapons unlocked, and by the end of Act 1, we'll be able to purchase 15 of the 20. Whether we'll have the money, that's a different story. In case throwing weapons at you doesn't give you confidence in the game's ability to raise stakes, after Ratchet fights his way through the Tyrannoid mechs and fighter ships, blasting through his old neighborhood and even into the wreckage of his garage home from Ratchet 1, you'll rendezvous with another Galactic Ranger squadron and lead them on a halo jump deep into enemy territory. Within 5 minutes of picking up the controller, you're jumping out of the back of a dropship and free-falling with your own militia past enemy missiles. It's a complete adrenaline rush. Now, something interesting that I rarely see discussed is that it's never actually explained why Nefarious chose to attack Veldin. Even though Ratchet just so happened to land right by his old house, it doesn't appear that this Dr. Nefarious, whoever he is concerned with our hero at all. Veldin throughout the series is described as a worthless backwater planet. It's obviously just a convenient excuse to get our heroes back home and kick some nostalgia up for players, but it's just kinda interesting. This second stage of Veldin's Invasion gives us a primer for one of Up Your Arsenal's key gimmicks, the sprawling battlefield arenas that we'll be frequenting throughout this game. These function as a great technical showcase, solid world building, and another smart optimization move, allowing the game's designers to repurpose many of the large multiplayer maps across multiple missions featuring these Galactic Rangers battling the Doctor's Tyrannoid army. While this area specifically isn't reused elsewhere, it's just a taste of what's to come very soon. After driving off the Tyrannoid invaders, Ratchet and Clank are put into contact with the Galactic President, Bill Clinton.
How are things on the front lines, soldier? Is that Secret Agent Clank?
Greetings, sir. We are here to help.
Well, this is an honor, and I see you brought your chauffeur along.
What? No. Hold on a second, sir.
Agent Clank, we must stop Dr. Nefarious.
You heard me. The President of the Galaxy in this game that came out in 2004 is furry Bill Clinton. Alright, this cutscene has got to be the most densely packed with humor in the entire franchise. It's not even 2 minutes long, and it just leaves me in stitches. We've got Bill Clinton being a fan of the fictional Secret Agent Clank character, somehow not remembering that Clank or his chauffeur Ratchet were the two that saved the galaxy 2 years ago, likely during his term in office. The whole sidekick gets all the spotlight and praise gimmick with Ratchet being blown off is always a great shtick, especially since Clank just leans into it. The President's top secret report on the only man to face Nefarious and survive is an exaggerated, made-for-TV documentary on the History Channel, and barely 10 minutes into this game, we get a dick joke.
I seen him run right through our camping site. He was buck naked, screaming and holding a banana. Or maybe it weren't a banana. It could be.
One of nature's mysteries.
Followed by the President insisting that whoever that jackoff is, they are the only person who can possibly save this galaxy, in front of the two guys that have saved 2 galaxies in 2 years, including this one. It's A+. This is why you hire a writer. As we move into the game's first proper level, this jungle on planet Florana, we run into some of the usual third game syndrome that tends to hit so many iconic franchises. The first game introduces everything and tends to stumble in a few spots, the second game fixes almost everything up and sets the tone going forward, and the third game tends to struggle to introduce many new features that don't end up feeling like unnecessary gimmicks. In this case, Insomniac had been struggling to think of new, meaningful types of crates that could complement the regular crates, ammo crates, nanotech, and explosive crates that had all been here since Game 1, as well as the metal crates that were in 1 but barely used in 2. The 2 new ideas that got implemented are pretty gimmicky timed power-ups that only last about 30 seconds. We have the Inferno crate, which makes Ratchet temporarily invincible and allows you to kill every enemy in 1 hit with your wrench, and the Jackpot crate, which gives you a 2x bolt multiplier similar to the multiplier you get in challenge mode in going Commando onward, except here you can't increase it past 2 times by killing enemies, but it also isn't taken away from you for taking damage. Neither is really used more than a handful of times throughout the game, or to really meaningfully impact gameplay all that much, but they were cool enough ideas to be included, and that was enough for company founder Ted Price to buy a case of beer for the person that thought them up. There was early on a third new crate type that would permanently upgrade your weakest weapon by 1 level, but that actually took away from playing the game, so that was cut pretty early on. And honestly, that's for the best. I usually avoid even using the Inferno crates, since using them means that you're wasting enemy experience that you could be earning for your weapons. And speaking of weapons, Florana gives us access to 2 new ones to purchase in the shop. We have our standard blaster weapon, which is just kind of a blaster, nothing to write home about, and the plasma whip, which has a much more interesting story. While playing around during pre-production, programmer Tony Garcia wanted to design an enemy that used a whip with realistic animations inspired by Soul Calibur's Ivy. However, to save the already swamped animator's time, he developed a whip that was coded to flow and react dynamically based on enemy and player positioning, although it didn't react realistically due to hardware limitations. But after the work that went in, and based on how impressive the whip looked when tested on the Chainblade boss from Ratchet 2, it was instead implemented as a really cool weapon for the player to use. And then, in a funny twist of fate, realistic whip physics were then tested by the team working on Insomniac's PlayStation 3 engine, and somehow that work was then reworked back into this game on weaker hardware as an enemy weapon. So 2 whips made it into Up Your Arsenal that reacted differently to their environments, and later in the first PS3 Ratchet game, a whip weapon was included again, but that one didn't revisit either of these dynamic styles, instead being hand animated and ending up as a rather boring weapon. Funny how that worked out. After fighting their way through the dense jungle, or just skipping the level with a well-placed jump, Ratchet and Clank run into a dense character. If the blurry silhouette wasn't clear enough, the former hero that we were looking at before is none other than Captain Qwark, driven so insane by his 2 consecutive failures at the hands of Ratchet and Clank, or maybe just by the crotchetizer tests, that he's secluded himself to a life as the leader of a monkey tribe. That life includes bestiality.
It was mating season. How could I have known she was your sister?
In his simian haze, or maybe because of some sort of simian syphilis, Qwark makes the duo trek through the
Path of Death!
And then fights them head-on, becoming submissive once defeated as he sees Ratchet as his new leader. With Ratchet, Clank, Qwark, and his monkey companion Scrunch all crammed into the tiny ship, the group heads to the Starship Phoenix, the first proper hub world in the Ratchet franchise. The Phoenix addresses many of the smaller issues that Going Commando had, for one, giving you a reliable location where you can purchase armor upgrades at any point in the game rather than sprinkling only a couple armor vendors on specific planets. It's also home to a virtual reality arena where you can gain experience for your weapons and health, an onboard video game system that we'll talk about later, and the Gadgetron weapons vendor on this command ship lets you try before you buy in that arena, which is really cool. But even cooler, this vendor lets you scan your memory card for a Ratchet & Clank 1 save file, and if you've got a save from after you spoke to the Gadgetron president in that game, you'll be given the permanent 10% employee discount just as he had promised you'd be eligible for after 2 or so years. Don't you just love continuity?
It's so hot, it's cool.
I think I got the wrong guy.
After many of this game's missions, you'll travel back to the Phoenix as a way of debriefing both Ratchet and Clank as well as the player, giving you a place to anchor yourself to this story, and, most importantly for the more imaginative younger players, giving you a place to connect more with all of this game's side characters and feel more at home in this universe. A few Galactic Rangers are constantly patrolling the ship's deck, different characters will occasionally chime in over the intercom, and a bit later on in the game, we'll be able to just hang out on the bridge and listen to flavor dialogue where different crew members make small talk.
You talking to me?
Do you have any idea what I'm supposed to be doing?
No?
It's these little pieces of world building that made me absolutely fall in love with this game back when I first played it, even more so than the first 2. Even if they were just throwaway lines, and even if this is just a basic hub, it added an extra sense of place that got me wondering what other stories could be told about Ratchet and Clank's expeditions as Galactic Rangers. It's the kind of home base that lends itself incredibly well to a serialized cartoon series, something in the vein of a kid's version of Star Trek, which I think now does exist. It'd be a good opening and closing location to serve to reset after every adventure. When I was 9 or 10, I wanted a model of the Phoenix. I wanted action figures to play with and act out my own dumb Ratchet & Clank adventures. Hell, I even sent Sony a letter at the time, a handwritten actual letter, suggesting that they make a toy line out of this game and its sequel, Ratchet Deadlocked, while I was thinking of all of the possibilities. And one of Sony Computer Entertainment's representatives even indulged some dumb kid and actually wrote me back, politely declining the idea, of course, before making an action figure line a couple years later anyway. I'm not saying they took my idea or anything, obviously. I'm sure they got dozens of these letters just like mine. But I am saying that if they did take my idea, they'd have made some bangin' Starship Phoenix and customizable Annihilation Nation or Dreadzone playsets, and they never did. Pfft, cowards. Shortly after landing on the Phoenix, Captain Qwark and Scrunch are placed into the Starship's convenient zoo enclosure, which is just part of the regular living quarters, and I'm glad they have that for a rainy day like today. And Ratchet and Clank prepare to formally meet the Phoenix's captain, Sasha, but when they enter the bridge, they find Sasha responding to a distress signal from President Clinton, who happens to be her father.
Mr. President! Dad! Are you there?
Dad?
Which makes Ratchet's earlier comment a little bit awkward.
Will you marry me?
Dr. Nefarious's troops have invaded the galactic capital on planet Marcadia, breaching the presidential compound, and the good doctor releases a warning shot to the galaxy, and what a perfect introduction to this character. In his transmission, Nefarious announces his plans to decimate every organic life form in the galaxy as a part of his goal to head a robot uprising. And he's even got his butler Lawrence doing sign language interpretation for any deaf robots out there. What a nice guy. With at least a bit of an idea now of who they're up against, our heroes rush to the capital city to meet up with the Galactic Rangers and secure the capital. Although the first level Florana was a split from Up Your Arsenal's high-octane Tyrannoid fighting introduction, a sort of cooldown to allow for some necessary exposition, Marcadia reaffirms that whether the pace is fast or slow, Ratchet 3's level design is taking a drastic shift from the first two games. Rather than separating different gameplay focuses into distinct and separate pathways, Insomniac began chaining them together in a linear sequence, effectively taking their design philosophy for just the final levels of the first two Ratchet games and implementing that back across almost every level here. On Veldin, we fought through two phases of invasion back to back. On Florana, we made our way through the jungle and then walked the path of death before our boss battle against Qwark. And here on Marcadia, we'll be fighting through the capital city before taking on our first series of sprawling Ranger battlefield missions, and then finally culminating in a puzzle section inside the presidential compound. With very few exceptions, every level in Ratchet 3 is chained together in this linear fashion, and even those exceptions depend on what your meaning of the word branch is. Two of those branches are optional series of battlefield missions that only unlock after you finish the main level, so not really a branch at all, just an optional bonus. One of them is the crystal hunting excursion that returns from going Commando, again unlocked only after you finish the level, leaving 3 levels in total that actually have multiple branched paths. For comparison, Ratchet 1 and 2 each only had 4 or 5 levels that did not have multiple separate paths. I say all this to highlight one of the larger sticking points with Up Your Arsenal. While so many fans adore it for being that complete package that both Ratchet 1 and 2 struggled to be at points, others lament that this game's great story and gameplay improvements came at the cost of, to them, that irreplaceable feeling of exploration and variety that made Ratchet. You cannot go wrong with any of these games. Each of them is one of the best that the PS2 ever saw, but over time, Up Your Arsenal's popularity has wavered a little bit because of its linearity. Me personally, I jump back and forth, because I did love that almost light Metroid approach that Ratchet 1 and 2 had at times. I loved how Going Commando was able to raise every single stake except for maybe the main villain. And I love that Up Your Arsenal raises its stakes in a very different way, including that main villain. Although the vast majority of this game's levels might be linear, that they're broken up into these little segments enhances each level's feeling of importance. It makes shorter levels feel bigger, better, and more meaningful to the overall story, and not just because of the occasional extra loading screen to mask that these levels were now too big to be contained in the PS2's 32 megabytes of memory. Let's take Marcadia for example. That initial linear rush through the city only lasts a brisk 5 minutes, bookended by quick cutscenes featuring the Rangers. You'll have just enough time to test out the returning Suck Cannon, or the new Infector weapon that turns enemies against one another, both weapons that you can buy when you first reach the Starship Phoenix. Or maybe you'll use that time to level up one of your current weapons once or twice, but otherwise, this is a quick in and out string of fights. After that, you'll spend only about 10 minutes in total clearing the presidential compound in this game's first series of Galactic Ranger missions, with this whole set of missions reusing this one flat little oval courtyard that happens to double as a map in the multiplayer. You won't really notice the reuse or repetition though, because the missions mask it well, whether you're being thrown into a turret and destroying waves of dropships, or running back and forth across the battlefield clearing Noids, or staying close to some rangers and defending them while they make repairs, or running back and forth again across this little map, but this time blasting more Noids with the Galactic Rangers' help and turning bolt cranks to activate the perimeter defenses. Between the mission variety and the Rangers' funny combat dialogue and anecdotes, these 10 minutes blow right by, and before you know it, you'll be meeting with the President.
My daughter tells me you're a man who's good with his hands, Ratchet.
Sir, I swear I never...
The city's laser shield went down during the attack. Now we are defenseless without it.
And then moving into the Planetary Defense Center to restore the city's shield system, where you're given the new refractor gadget. With many of the Insomniac designers' ideas exhausted by the back-to-back of the first two games, designer Mike Stout turned to a tried-and-true inspiration: Zelda. The Refractor's gimmick was directly inspired by The Legend of Zelda's Mirror Shield, allowing you to redirect laser beams, including some enemy attacks, and I'd argue its Zelda inspiration is part of what makes this one of the better gadgets throughout the entire series. I mean, after all, if you're gonna take from the best, right? The refractor sections are simple to grasp, quick to execute, impossible to mess up since the puzzles only work one way, and yet they still make the player feel like they've actually done something, even if that something is just moving a beam of light slightly. And once you've completed all of the puzzles, you're rewarded yet again with another cutscene, the fourth one in just this level, where Ratchet and Clank run into Big Al for the first time since Ratchet 1, the latter giving the duo a Captain Qwark playable vid-comic that might just be the key to jog Ape Qwark's memory. By funneling the level design together in this manner, yes, we did lose some planetary exploration, but we gained a more focused mission structure that better fit this game's plot, and it helped us gain a plot whose quality wasn't a common point of debate like with the first two games. No matter which game in this trilogy is your favorite, it's just about unanimous that this game's story earns high marks. And with cutscenes acting as semicolons just about every time the game jumps from one section to the next within a level, you can see both how these raised stakes bring the best out of the levels, and why the animators struggled to finish all the cinematics on time. And what's perhaps more interesting is that Up Your Arsenal, despite aiming for a shooter platforming balance, lost much of that platforming focus as a result of this chained level design. This was the point at which Insomniac felt it had really hit its stride, and where the studio had discovered exactly what it thought made a great Ratchet & Clank game. This so-called Ratchet checklist would be tweaked and tuned over time as more games would come out, but internally, this was the first time a game featured the entire checklist, including a well-written buddy story, ensuring that Captain Qwark was included from the outset, focusing on these vibrant worlds, and of course that trademark, whimsical, Douglas Adams-inspired humor. And for those of you that might be too young to recall who Douglas Adams is, he's actually the second president of the United States. Yeah, small world. Other focuses of this little internal checklist include weapons that were both creative and strategic, an attempt that's clear here with weapons such as the Infector, but maybe not a successful attempt since the more strategic weapons tend to be outclassed immediately. And although a shooter platforming balance was touted as a key ingredient in the Ratchet formula, Up Your Arsenal is undeniably more of a shooter than a platformer in almost all of its main levels. Really, the main platforming that we'll see in most levels is in the form of the strafing side jumps that players use to dodge and duck between enemy fire. That's the most platforming that we get in the main game, but there's actually an entire platforming game within a game in Ratchet 3, that Captain Qwark vid-comic that we just received from Big Al. While Qwark was an early focus of Up Your Arsenal to avoid another last-minute rewrite like going Commando, the gameplay of Qwark's vid-comic ran into some notable struggles. In addition to acting as another fun way to forward the main plot and give us backstory about Qwark, Nefarious, and their early battles, these sections are the main chunk of gameplay variety that Up Your Arsenal sees besides the Ranger missions. Initially conceptualized as its own Mega Man X-styled side game focusing on Qwark, and later lumped into Ratchet 3 as a game within a game, with bits of backtracking, puzzles, and 4 different weapons that Qwark could swap between as if he was a little mini Ratchet himself, these 2D side-scrollers ended up going through a major redesign due to their overambitious scope. Just as Insomniac had run into in Going Commando before it with the space combat and the racing, it rediscovered here that designing a minigame that feels true to the world of the larger game can require the same amount of work and polish that designing an entirely separate game itself would be. And considering that there was also an entire multiplayer game being designed separately from Ratchet 3 as it was, as well as new versions of racing and space combat being ground up redesigned from Going Commando, and those ranger missions that required weeks of work to put together thanks to ground up reworking of the game's enemy pathfinding, at a certain point it's just not feasible, both thanks to the physical restrictions of a PS2's disc size, as well as the lack of time they had to do all of this to begin with. It also helped that the game's target audience, kids aged about 10 or younger, first off by and large wouldn't even know what Mega Man X was at the time, and that some of these kids apparently struggled during focus tests with the subpar original designs of the 2D platformer gameplay. Remember that side-scroller gameplay on consoles had been dwindling during the early 3D era, and that the Nintendo DS came out after this game. Even with the great sales of the Game Boy or GBA, there were more kids that hadn't played many side-scrollers than had. And on top of that, given this game's constant struggles with development timelines, it just wasn't possible to rework the original gameplay design in a more user-friendly way without going well out of scope. In Ratchet 3's secret Insomniac museum showcasing some of the game's cut content, you can find the much harder original version of this first vid-comic, with multiple branching pathways that you needed to explore to unlock the main path forward, and you can find another cut vid-comic level that was much heavier on the platforming, the original test level for this gameplay approach. Both of these are, frankly, not really all that fun, and even a seasoned platforming fan could run into trouble on these, and since it wouldn't have been smart to lock progress to a secondary game mode with which many kids might struggle, the gameplay was dialed back into a far more basic platformer. With a slimmed-down version of Ratchet's main gameplay, Insomniac ensured that players could easily transition back and forth between these 2D Qwark vidcomics and the main 3D attraction, and Insomniac worked in further incentives so that players would look at these vidcomics as a positive instead of just another side gimmick. For example, each vidcomic has a skill point that challenges you to beat it in under a certain time limit, and somehow these vidcomics pay you in real bolts for beating them, or, as I like to call it, a reverse microtransaction. If you collect all 100 of the Qwark tokens sprinkled throughout each comic, you'll get a titanium bolt for your troubles, which in this game are used to buy different skins for Ratchet. With far more forgiving checkpoints than the rest of Up Your Arsenal, you'll never have to worry about dying or losing the tokens you've collected thus far. And if you find the hidden green Qwark token in each of these levels, you'll gain a permanent health increase for Captain Qwark that tracks across each episode of these vidcomics, encouraging at least a little bit of exploration, even if it wasn't nearly as much as originally scoped out. And all of these changes worked because the vidcomics were some of my favorite parts of Ratchet 3 growing up, because they were just the perfect bit of variety sprinkled in at just the right story beats. And since this is the most platforming that the game had, and I love me some solid platforming and collecting, it scratched the itch enough that when I was younger, I never really thought about how combat heavy the main game was compared to the first two. Plus, with such ridiculously exaggerated, quirked up stories that even the vidcomic's own narrator scoffed at, they fed well into the rest of the game's humor. This first vidcomic, for example, opens with Qwark supposedly fighting off a spaceship full of robotic pirate ghosts, a plot so asinine that the narrator refuses to read it. I mean, who would actually make that?
I'm a little teapot, short and stout.
But somehow, this dumb plot is enough to jog Monkey Qwark's memories in the real world, and soon enough he's back to his old self, for better or worse. In fact, in the time it takes Ratchet & Clank to fight through a death course and some arena battles for the hit game show Annihilation Nation, Qwark's already cleaned himself up. He's rewritten his own personal history so that instead of going insane, he was actually protecting wildlife, and with President Clinton's blessing, he's taken charge in the war on Nefarious. Annihilation Nation is Up Your Arsenal's main arena, a destination that, like the Starship Phoenix, will come back to a couple times as the plot necessitates. In this first instance, Ratchet & Clank head there to obtain the Tira-Guise gadget, an updated holo-guise from Ratchet & Clank 1 that instead of changing Ratchet's appearance to that of a robot, instead turns him into one of Nefarious's alien henchmen, convenient for those high-stakes break-ins. While they're here, they can also grab the second Qwark vidcomic, which isn't actually needed to progress the story, and complete a number of extra challenges to earn bolts and experience. Along with the Phoenix's VR arena that I mentioned earlier, these two feature in total about twice as many missions as the arenas from Going Commando, although a good chunk of these are actually death courses rather than regular arena fights. The death courses are half Wipeout-styled obstacle courses except above lava instead of water, and half fighting against robot gladiators along the way. All of these follow similar paths with slightly changed parts here or there, but on top of the sleazy game show vibe they give off with cameras flying right in your face and the fake suspense of being forced to go through door number 1 or 2, they're different enough and spread out enough that they're a fun distraction. And again, more jumping to balance out all of the shooting is a plus with this game, so I'll take them. The regular arena challenges are great as well, with new round types that'll sometimes pop up like the sleeper round, in which Ratchet is constantly losing health, or one where you're forced to randomly change weapons. Annihilation Nation is also home to 2 new bosses, one a tag team fight against a brother and sister duo with the sister using that physics-based whip I mentioned earlier, and another against a French alien brain in a jar controlling a flaming scorpion tank because Ratchet and Clank. By the time you first head to this arena, you'll already have 8 weapons either available for purchase or already in your arsenal, and by the time that you come back a few levels from now, that'll be up to 13. That's, again, 13 out of 20. Since Up Your Arsenal is really forward with unlocking weapons, but simultaneously really stingy with its weapon prices, it's best to clear out the arena as soon as you possibly can, because otherwise you'll be playing catch-up the entire game both with bolts and with weaker weapons, and because you'll have fewer bolts, you'll be forced to wait on buying the upgraded armor sets, and with fewer combat encounters, you'll be leveling up Ratchet's health less. So essentially, the arena is expected to be part of your playtime here, not just a bonus like in Ratchet 2. Even with the 10% Gadgetron employee discount, I usually can't afford the Spitting Hydra until after a few of these arena challenges, even though it's available for purchase as soon as you get to level 2. And once you get to the arena, you'll have to spend 54 to 60,000 more bolts if you want the Agents of Doom, an upgraded version of Ratchet 1's Glove of Doom. And trust me, you want the Agents of Doom, because as they upgrade, they unlock shoulder-mounted laser cannons and eventually explode in a nuclear eruption when they charge into enemies. The Annihilation Nation arena is incidentally the main place where you'll end up using the Inferno crate, since you'll be invincible while in Inferno mode, and this giant invincible disco ball turret thing is a real pain in the arsenal. Whenever you decide you're done with the arena detour, you can head back to the Starship Phoenix, where Qwark establishes a new supergroup of elite soldiers, the Q-Force. And by elite, I mean Ratchet and Clank, who do all of the work, plus Qwark, Helga, and Al, who pretty much only ever sit there, Sasha and pro hoverboarder Skid McMarks, who actually help out a couple times, and Scrunch the Monkey, who's somehow the most helpful one besides Ratchet and Clank themselves. Essentially, this all sounds like a dumb Ratchet & Clank fanfiction, bringing back in a bunch of characters from the first game and throwing them together in a ragtag group for no reason, which kid me loved, and, well, actually adult me loves this too because it's all just played so well that it works. Qwark unveils the first of his brilliant crayon-drawn infiltration plans.
First, Ratchet and Clank will descend to the sea floor and wade through a series of tunnels flooded with waist-high raw sewage.
What?
Please hold your questions until the end of the presentation.
And from there, Ratchet and Clank head to Nefarious' underwater base on planet Aquatos, where players get to deal with an escort mission. Fellow Q-Forcer Skid decides to show up and help the duo by hacking into parts of the base's mainframe. Huh, he's a hacker. I wonder if that'll ever show up again. Nah, it probably never will. But since Skid's such a wuss, you've got to defeat every nearby enemy before he'll move forward. At the very least, he doesn't take damage, so it's not really a true escort mission, and I'm happy about that. One touch I love about this level is that most of the enemies you'll fight are the amoeboid monsters that make their first appearance since Ratchet & Clank 1. This won't make much sense at first, but if you go back and play the second Qwark Vid-Comic you got at the arena, you'll find out that Nefarious created these amoeboid monsters during his first attack on the galaxy, and he happened to be responsible for the infestation that you fought through in Blackwater City in the first game. It's an awesome little double punch of lore that rewards you for putting the dots together. After escorting Skid through the first part of the base, featuring, fun fact, the only underwater swimming sections in the entire game, which is probably fair since I don't know really what else you can do with swimming sections after the first 2 games, Skid runs off when he gets frightened by Slim Cognito. You know, the guy from Going Commando that sold you weapon mods. Apparently he fled the Bogon Galaxy and went into hiding after selling a... well, you know what? I'll let him tell you himself.
I had a small run-in with the cops concerning a suck cannon upgrade that was mistakenly sold to a minor. I swear the kid looked 18.
Nope, don't like that one bit. But hey, he's offering us some of our old Megacorp guns from Going Commando, so a sale's a sale. And if you have a Going Commando save file, he'll give these weapons to you for free. For now, we can get the mini turret glove and the lava gun, and a couple times near the end of the game, he'll call Ratchet back to let him know that he can buy some new weapons that, quote-unquote, fell off of a truck. The bouncer, plasma coil, and shield charger. Hearing that both the bouncer and plasma coil are back is great news since I love those guns, but even better news is that unlike the weapons that were carried over from Ratchet 1 into Ratchet 2, these guns were rebalanced with up your arsenal in mind, so they're actually useful. While I still love the bouncer, and I actually think that the plasma coil is better in this game than it was in Going Commando, the lava gun is the most noteworthy of these additions, as it's a little note from Insomniac saying, "Hey, we listened, sorry." In Going Commando, this weapon upgraded to the meteor gun, and it completely changed the basic utility of this weapon, but here it will instead evolve into the liquid nitrogen gun at level 5, still spewing the same liquid spray as the lava gun, but instead freezing enemies solid. The mini turrets, when upgraded, will begin teleporting to follow you, and they'll start shooting at crates when no enemies are nearby, which are both great upgrades to keep these things useful, although they did get a bit of a nerf damage-wise compared to the previous game. As for the shield charger, well, you actually can't get that until the final level of this game, so it's really not all that useful until challenge mode. After putting it in Slim Cognito's slot, Ratchet and Clank split up and work together in one of the coolest sections of this entire game, as we jump back and forth between our two heroes as they help one another break into Nefarious' inner chamber. Not only is this probably the best Clank section in the PS2 saga of Ratchet games, it's, I'd argue, probably the best one all the way until 2009. In part thanks to Clank's new banana gun, which he can use to lure Scrunch the monkey on the switches or distract enemies from Clank. Although the banana gun is a simple addition, Scrunch is a great way to spice up what would otherwise be the same old gameplay that we already exhausted in Ratchet & Clank's 1 and 2 using the returning Gadgebots. Again, nobody at Insomniac really had any great idea of what to do with Clank by this point. However, the addition of Scrunch isn't the reason that this section works so well in my opinion. Instead, it's the stakes behind the Clank gameplay. As Clank works his way through the upper path, we'll jump back down to the lower path and take control of Ratchet, who's using his new Tira guys to blend in with the little alien guards and talk his way past the gates in their language, Tiranese, which is just burps and farts. Naturally. The actual Tira Guys minigame itself, like the Clank gameplay, isn't really that great on its own. This is just an average little rhythm minigame that's saved by the hilarious written dialogue between the Noids and Ratchet. Seriously, somehow writer Brad Santos was able to sneak in a line about Amoeboids gone wild, including the line, "You won't believe what those slimy co-eds will do when the cameras are rolling." I cannot believe that line made it through, but somehow the sum of these two decent at best parts works to become a greater whole. Maybe it's because what would otherwise feel like two different pointless stealth sections have a direct purpose towards one another. We see Ratchet get the Tyrannoids to raise a bridge so that Clank can advance in his section, and we see Clank unlock gates for Ratchet to get through. And, unlike a similar back and forth section in Ratchet 2, we see this teamwork all in real time as the camera pans between our two heroes, who finally kind of feel like equals for the first time during this section. It's one of the few times in the entire Ratchet series that we get to have Clank working side by side with Ratchet rather than just being a backpack or going off on his own, and it's just about the only time it happens outside of the co-op games. As a result, it's far and away the most important that Clank feels throughout this series, again, probably until 2009. Well, at least until 2008 if we count the Secret Agent Clank video game. And speaking of Agent Clank, it helps Clank even more that these sections feel like actual stealth sections that could take place in his fictional films and shows. It almost feels like this Agent Clank character maybe helped him out a little bit in training for moments like these. It may not have trained him, though, for the revelation at the end of this level that Dr. Nefarious is the biggest Secret Agent Clank fan in the entire galaxy.
That is rather disturbing. disturbing.
With some encrypted coordinates now in their hands, the duo regroups back at the Phoenix, or if you'd like to take a bit of a detour, they can spend some time hunting for sewer crystals to sell to the plumber. If you're wondering what sewer crystals are, it's poo. Crystallized poo. In an attempt to bring back the crystal hunting from Going Commando, while also saving time and resources, the crystals in this game are thrown into a series of indistinguishable sewer tunnels where the only enemies are amoeboids and big amoeboids. At 2,000 bolts per turd, I would call it a good way to earn bolts, but where Going Commando's crystal sections were invigorating changes of pace thanks to their wider level design, in a game here full of wider battlefields, this is an uncharacteristically claustrophobic slog, to the point that even finding your way to the central sewer line, which will bring you back to the start of the area, can take far longer than it needs to. We'll call this another casualty of time and resources, although part of it is that one of the area's designers immediately pawned it off to somebody else when he realized it wasn't going to turn out well. Following Qwark's next harebrained plan, Ratchet & Clank joined the Galactic Rangers on a fight through the Tyrannoid home planet, Tyrannosis. With a name like that and such a similar red-brown color scheme, Sony should count itself pretty lucky that it didn't receive any menacing letters from Lucasfilm. This is easily the most experimental planet in Up Your Arsenal, beginning with a halo drop deep into Tyrannoid mortar encampments before opening up into an almost Halo-esque battlefield where you'll drive a machine gun-mounted buggy across a wide map to take down 4 enemy bases in whichever order you desire. It's such an oddly refreshing breakaway from anything Ratchet had attempted prior, and it's successfully able to simulate this huge, massive planet-wide conflict, even though the only friendly soldier you'll run into is Scrunch, who mans, or monkeys, the buggy's machine gun. Each of the 4 bases spread across this map open up their own unique combat encounters, ensuring that none of these 4 feel like retreaded ground, and once the massive anti-air turrets at all 4 bases are destroyed, the Galactic Ranger dropship can move in and take this invasion to Phase 3 of 4. Inside the Tyrannoid hive, we get the single most Zelda boss in the entire Ratchet & Clank franchise, and it just so happens to be one of my favorite bosses too. I mean, right down to the Tyrannoid Queen's introduction, it feels like a love letter to Ocarina of Time's Goma. All we need is the boss's name to pop up as menacing text on screen, and for this thing's weakness to be her eyes. Obviously, fighting this thing isn't going to be a one-to-one Zelda affair, but thanks to the arena's grid structure and her attacks, she'll be a very pattern-focused fight as you're pumping her full of lead while constantly backing up and jumping to dodge her sweep attacks. When you've dealt enough damage, like any good Zelda fight, the Queen breaks into her second phase, but first we pan away from Ratchet and into the perspective of one of the Queen's eyes, still controlling our hero as he flees from her missile barrage, but from her point of view. Again, this sort of thing when I was younger, mind-blowing. And after a more difficult second phase in a more open arena with no pillars for you to use to hide from the Queen's machine gun attacks, you'll finally defeat her, only for Qwark to take all the credit and public adulation, of course. But even after all of this, there's still some work you can do here on Tyrannosis if you want some extra bolts, as the Rangers are invading the Kavu Island Combination Tyrannoid base and multiplayer map. This string of missions acts as a basic primer for Ratchet 3's multiplayer Siege mode, taking you from your allied base all the way around this crescent map to destroy the disco ball turret things that protect the enemy base. Along the way, you'll even get to try out the new hover ship, and as a treat, you'll get to fight these homing launchers that fire missiles directly up into the air off-screen so that you can't see them coming back down to hit you. That's not a treat at all. With no fair way to dodge their attacks, this missile launcher was the second recipient of the Snow Beast Award, which you'll recall from my Going Commando retrospective, is the tongue-in-cheek award given out within the studio for the worst feature that shipped as part of an Insomniac game that year. It probably says a lot that even when it comes to these Ranger missions, the big new gameplay gimmick that was meant to carry up your arsenal a bit, I'm not talking a ton about the game's combat itself, because anything I could say I've already exhausted just by saying it's Going Commando, but a little bit better. For one, that's a massive testament to how amazing Going Commando is, that the best that they could do and what's often considered the best Ratchet game is just more of that one. But it's also a testament to Up Your Arsenal's unique position behind the scenes. According to programmer Tony Garcia, who had worked in quality assurance on Ratchet 1 and then as a programmer on Going Commando and Up Your Arsenal, one of the things about Ratchet 3 that was very interesting was that the team working on Ratchet 3 was pretty young in a lot of areas. I don't have the numbers exactly, and while there were a lot of veterans on the team, I do believe that we probably had more very new to the industry types working on that game than we had on the previous projects. In addition, because we were now working on the third game in the franchise, we were also breaking some interesting new ground in that people who were coming on board the team were coming in as previous fans of the franchise, which wasn't something that had been possible on 1, obviously, or 2 since it turned around so quickly. With a team made up of not only less experienced workers, many fresh out of college mind you, but also fans of the Ratchet franchise already, fans that again, keep in mind, likely couldn't have played much if any of 2 before they'd been hired to work on 3, it feels to me that this team was put into a bit of a unique situation, where the current Insomniacs knew exactly the kind of game they wanted to make, a bigger and better Going Commando, while the new blood was working on the sequel to the sequel of the game that they had loved, working with the people that had made that game, leading them by example without having fully played the game that bridged the two. To draw a comparison here, this would be like a college student who played and loved The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, getting hired to work on Majora's Mask just a few months later, even though they hadn't gotten past the Kid Link part of Ocarina yet. Except remember that I noted earlier that the onboarding process for new hires was greatly accelerated thanks to Up Your Arsenal almost immediately running behind schedule, so now that college fan doesn't even get a full proper training before being thrown into the fire. Sprinkle in a bit of the design team running out of many interesting new ideas for gadgets or puzzles, and you start leaning even more into the third-person shooter side of the game than I think was already intended to begin with. And this is compounded by the fact that a small handful of senior Insomniacs had already moved onto the early work for Resistance, leaving current programmers to mentor the new junior programmers. According to one programmer I spoke with, nobody at Insomniac ever told them that this was part of the plan. It was just assumed that by seating a new hire next to the old guard that there would be some mentoring that would take place. In practice, according to this programmer, this meant that they had to keep answering questions while fighting to get their own work done on a continually shrinking timeline. Already, it's pretty clear to anybody listening that the weight of the project may have been cracking some foundations, and as tends to happen, developers started cutting tiny corners wherever possible to save time or resources. And if this all wasn't enough as it was to doom a game, there's another wrench in here too. At one point early on in this project, one of the company's most senior programmers, Ricardo Rodriguez, suddenly left Insomniac, leaving a large hole in his absence and surprising many of the former Insomniacs with whom I spoke. Although I wasn't able to discern the exact reason he suddenly left due to some sort of legal issue or settlement surrounding his departure, I suspect that his departure may have been part of the reason that the game fell behind earlier on in development. That said, I do have a theory as to why he left and as to why it's so hush-hush, but I haven't been able to verify this, so do keep in mind this is just a theory. Before he left Insomniac, Rodriguez, according to one ex-Insomniac I spoke to, seemed like he may have been scouting for talent, and in 2004, he founded High Impact Games, a developer that would end up hiring many former Insomniacs, and the company that produced the 2 PlayStation Portable Ratchet titles, using many of the ideas that were left on the cutting room floor during Rodriguez's time at Insomniac. And during his tenure at the top of High Impact, Rodriguez was supposedly adamantly opposed to crunching or unrealistic development timelines, so could he have been trying to take a chunk of the studio with him to greener pastures out of frustration with Insomniac's management? I can't say definitively, of course, but that's a theory that I've had. And since we're digging, let's peel back the layers even more than that. Near the start of this retrospective, I mentioned that it was during Up Your Arsenal's development that an in-house level editing tool named Luna was also being worked on, and on top of this, a separate scripting tool programmed in the Lua programming language was also being worked on. Luna and Lua, that won't get confusing at all. Both of these were attempts to make it easier for designers to implement their designs directly into the game themselves without needing to rely on programmers. These, however, according to every programmer I spoke with, were not incorporated into Up Your Arsenal's development, and instead, a designer would work closely with a programmer to bring their designs to life, just as had been done in the previous 2 games. I would say that from the outside looking in, this sounds like a great way to play the telephone game back and forth, but I don't have to say that. Programmer Tim Trepich, who worked on Ratchets 1 through 3 and had a pedigree running back to the Sega Genesis days, told me that the back and forth between programmer and designer was often very inefficient. Trepich told me that he had tried multiple times to optimize this during his time across the trilogy to make the tools more powerful so that designers could fine-tune on their own, or even to make the programming work more intuitive for the designers that were maybe a little bit less experienced as coders, but that these efforts went ignored, or worse, by upper staff. Instead, from Ratchets 1 to 3 at least, and my understanding is that Deadlock was designed in this same way as well, the Insomniac workflow included a designer providing the work to a programmer, with some designers collaborating more and making it a fruitful back and forth flow, and others dictating their designs and then figuratively or literally hovering over a programmer's shoulder as the latter placed every object in a level one by one. If you were a junior programmer, you might be doing more of that grunt work of placing the level objects, all while still learning what exactly you're supposed to be doing from a more senior programmer who's also potentially dealing with a designer over their shoulder for the work they're doing, while they still have to help you. If a designer's work, well, didn't work that well, they could go back to the drawing board or try to work together, or, as was allegedly sometimes the case, they could dig their heels in and make things harder for their programming partner. And none of this is factoring in the art and animation teams, still crunching away at cinematics and level art, and sometimes spilling over into discussions of whether it would be possible or worth it to, say, add proper lip syncing to the Q-Force dialogue on the bridge that only a percentage of players would ever see or notice. As can happen in any workplace, occasionally arguments got heated within the studio, but thankfully it doesn't sound like they ever boiled over too much. Those animators, by the way, were also probably counting themselves lucky that there was never a plan to include the Rainbow Afrolyzer as a functional weapon in this game. Instead, it made its way into Act 2's first cutscene as a little reference. Once Ratchet and Clank have returned to the Phoenix, and with Ratchet regaling his fight against the Queen Tyrannoid, Dr. Nefarious and Lawrence breach the ship with a hologram transmission. After Dr. Nefarious gloats at how informidable the Q-Force looks, and then reveals that, like President Clinton, he too thinks that Agent Clank is a real secret agent. Okay. The transmission is traced back to planet Dax, named after some loudmouthed rat creature. This planet, as Nefarious' weapons facility, had been home to many diabolical tests, including a device that forced a rainbow afro onto the target's head and forced them to dance uncontrollably. This was a conceptualized weapon for Ratchet 2, but again, the animation teams had far too much on their plate to begin with. Don't worry, I'm sure we'll never see a dancing weapon in this series ever again. Dax is one of the few levels in Up Your Arsenal that evokes its predecessor's branching paths, which may be in part because this level was another product of a crunched time frame. The planet's designer, Colin Munson, ended up in a situation where he had to map out the design for 3 or 4 levels all in one 5-week time frame, when traditionally each level would take 5 weeks on its own. Since Munson wanted to focus his time on the other levels that he was working on, he decided to more or less copy homework from one of Going Commando's most internally praised levels, Planet Dabo. The resemblance is pretty clear between the similar enemy designs and even some chunks of the level really evoking Ratchet 2's testing facility. There's not much that I can say about Dax itself as a result. Thanks to the amount of enemy fire all funneled at you from one direction, it's a pretty good place to use the new Holo Shield launcher that unlocked in the previous level, but the Holo Shield really isn't as useful as I'd hope in this game, considering that it takes a really long time to earn experience from absorbing the enemy attacks. There's a pretty cool platforming section where you're running and using your new Hypershot gadget to avoid this attack ship destroying the ground from below, and the boss fight against that ship is neat, but at the same time, the Hypershot is just a combination of the Swing Shot and Ratchet 2's Dynamo, so it's just the same old again. Otherwise, both in terms of design and story, Dax has always felt a little bit fillery for me. One of the 3 routes is just a path to get the charge boots, which you don't really need in this game. The path through the weapons facility leads to you learning that the reason you came here, the plans for Nefarious' super secret weapon, the Bio-Obliterator, were actually moved to the next planet, and after defeating that attack ship on the 3rd part of the level, you're told to go right back to Annihilation Nation to progress. The only real saving grace of this level is, of course, one of the best and dumbest cutscenes in the entire series, featuring robot pop star Courtney
This going
She always seems so sweet and innocent in her videos. Well, except for that one with the, you know.
I've realized over time that anytime I stop playing Up Your Arsenal, it's right around this string of levels in Act 2. All of my old save files, both on PS2 and PS3, stopped not long after Dax on one of the subsequent 2 or 3 levels, I think because the game starts to stretch a bit thin here, and we've seen almost everything that it's going to have to offer besides story. Right now, you'll have access to 75% or more of this game's weapons, and only one of the remaining few is an all-new style of gun. As I've already said, I've rolled credits on this game 100 times, so if I want my fill of Up Your Arsenal, it makes sense that I might only play the stellar first act and get out in a couple of hours before it starts to get stale. Even then, when I think back, this is always where I stopped after I first completed the game. Which is even more interesting since one of the 2 story forks here is one of my favorite levels in the entire game. That would be the Obani Moons, a 2-in-1 level featuring both of the spherical mini-worlds that appear in Ratchet 3, custom gravity and all. The first is a really quick but fun refractor section where we relink a series of satellites, following the laser as it arcs across the curved horizon, followed by a full-scale Ratchet level mapped onto one of these spherical moons. This is exactly what I wanted when I first saw the spherical gravity when I first played Ratchet 2, to see a level with proper combat encounters against more than just a couple basic enemies, and this delivers and then some. Even though the never-ending combat is starting to drag the game's pace a bit, I always try to make it at least to the end of this level just because it's a personal favorite of mine. At least until it ends when we hit a wall, and this is usually where I actually stop playing. With the third and final of this trio of moons protected by a force field, and Skid for some reason here trying to break in with a crowbar, we have no choice but to leave for now. Across the way down the other story fork, we head to the arena, where Clank offers to book Courtney Gears into an episode of the Agent Clank show, and then we go to the Agent Clank set to play a level in the character of the secret agent himself, with the director yelling at us and all. We even get a giant Clank fight against a Godzilla-like monster, which... yeah, there's a reason that we never see Giant Clank again after this in the Insomniac Ratchet games. The gimmicks kind of already run dry. Afterwards, we find out that Courtney Gears is, obviously, actually in cahoots with Dr. Nefarious, and, not so obviously, maybe in bed with him?
I have a present for you, Snicky Wookums.
Ugh, imagine those two going at it. Gross. Ratchet, meanwhile, is at his trailer waiting for Clank to finish shooting, completely oblivious to his friend's capture. The ensuing fight with the Tyrannoids that invade the set, because of course they do, is fine. The level gimmick of working through a bunch of Hollywood lots and warehouses is an awesome vibe, but again, it's just kind of more combat, with a few of the hacker gadget puzzles to break up the shooting. At the very least, I do like the hacker. It's a more involved gadget than the ones featured in the previous games, even if it's clearly just Tempest. But hey, I didn't know what Tempest was at the time, so I was fine with it. But even though this level is far and away where I've stopped playing Up Your Arsenal the most, it's home to my favorite weapon in the game, the Rift Inducer, which fires out a black hole that sucks enemies up. The ability to fire multiple of these rifts at once and watch as they warp space and time, inching ever closer to one another before combining into an even bigger, more powerful wormhole is just so cool. And watching enemies flail as they circle the drain, man, it's such an incredible set and forget weapon that I never forget it. I just end up staring at the carnage and chuckling.
That is rather disturbing.
But don't forget, this whole Courtney Gears saga has been a slight detour from our main goal, even if it did loop back into the main plot thanks to Nefarious grinding gears. Nope, still gross. Once Ratchet makes his way to the other side of the set, he finds Clank, who's acting a little bit different. But hey, Clank somehow found Nefarious' exact location and escaped, I guess. We won't get to find Nefarious yet though, because of course, we've got another detour to go on. It's been a whole hour without some Ranger missions, and it's about time we do some more. The Galactic Rangers this time are under siege in Blackwater City, which on paper sounds like a great way to revisit one of Ratchet 1's best levels. But in practice, it's just a random multiplayer map that's Blackwater City in name only. After saving the Rangers behind yet again in a handful of missions, one of the Rangers gives Ratchet a pair of gravity boots, because I guess Ratchet was in such a rush at the start of the game that he forgot to pack his bags. It's a good thing this game doesn't have any grind boot tracks, or else he'd have been screwed. At the very least, this is the dumbest lead up to the new item jingle in the entire trilogy. I love it for that alone.
I tripped over these gravity boots while I was running from the Tyrannoids. I believe they're your size.
Now, depending on your playstyle, you might tackle this Blackwater City fight a few planets earlier. I usually do it in this order because Blackwater City is frankly the least enjoyable of the Ranger side ventures, clearly the one most shoehorned in as padding. Like with most of these Ranger missions, it's just short enough that I don't mind it all that much in the moment, but when I step back to look at it more critically, all of these little, just short enough moments add up enough to lead to me tuning out here so often. Not every multiplayer map needed to be reused in the single-player campaign, and the thing is, Insomniac clearly did know this because half of the multiplayer maps were multiplayer only, including a callback to Ratchet 1's Planet Hoven that I almost expect to find out was originally meant for the campaign too. While we're on the subject, now's as good a time as any to talk about Ratchet 3's online mode. As I mentioned earlier, Up Your Arsenal was one of the first PS2 games to feature online multiplayer through the PS2's broadband adapter. With no real idea of what online design would entail, the multiplayer component of Up Your Arsenal was put together by a small, separate team that rapidly fluctuated in size, starting with just one programmer and a couple designers and ending up with a much, much larger crew. At one point, the multiplayer beta tests were pushed up from July to June 2004 because the studio realized that they'd have no time to implement changes and consider feedback in the few weeks before they had to start printing the discs. Because of this, as well as many, many other issues, half of Insomniac's 16 QA testers ended up working full-time on the online mode, all while nobody was even sure what the multiplayer's player base would even look like. I'd venture to guess that the vast majority of players that bought Ratchet 3 maybe played a couple rounds of the split-screen multiplayer, but never got to or cared enough to bring the game online. But the thing that's worth noting is that while today so many players look at this multiplayer and wonder, man, why would they even spend their time on that? Just make the single player larger. If you look at the context, Ratchet 3's multiplayer was necessary because it was historic. I checked just about every single console game that had released up until this point, and by my count, Ratchet 3 is only the third console game ever to feature simultaneous split-screen and online play, meaning that you can play with a buddy on your couch while also online with up to 6 other players. You might be thinking that one of those other two had to be Halo, but Ratchet 3's release date being pushed up a week actually means that it released a week before Halo 2, and thus Halo 2's multiplayer. Star Wars Battlefront beat both of them by a few weeks to the split-screen online game, and before that, the first console game that I could find with split-screen online was Tribe's Aerial Assault, which, mind you, came out before the PS2's broadband adapter, so you were playing that with a buddy on your couch with a 56K modem. That's just incredible. So while you might question at first why so much time and so many resources were dedicated to making essentially a separate game that only 5% of players may have ever even tried, it was more than worth trying because there's a universe out there where Up Your Arsenal is the big breakthrough in console online multiplayer instead of Halo 2, and that's just incredible to think about, even more so when you remember that Ratchet 1 came out a year after Halo 1, and here, this third game in this franchise is out right before Halo 2, beating it to the punch. It's a shame that so many of us didn't get to try the online much when it was active on the PS2 because the main Siege mode is really cool and the fast-paced Ratchet gameplay translated into a PvP battle is a sight to behold. In Siege mode, you'll work with your team to capture a series of nodes across the map by defeating the defense turrets and turning bolt cranks. Once a node is yours, you can spawn there upon death, and more importantly, it brings you closer to the enemy's base. Each team has a slightly different base in terms of defenses, but both have these giant disco Gatling gun turrets as their main defense. Once you destroy them, you can teleport into the enemy base's interior, and all you have to do is destroy the power core inside to win the game. All the while, you can find and equip each of the 9 weapons spread across the map, all but 3 of which are weapons that are reused from 1 and going Commando, since this game's multiplayer was developed ahead of and separately from the main game before 3's weapons were even actually designed. By killing enemy players, the weapons will level up just like in the main game, and the buggy and hovership are also available in some maps as well, with each allowing for a driver and a passenger to help shoot at or bomb enemies. On top of all this, gadgets like the Hypershot and Gravity Boots are available by default for swinging across large gaps or walking on magnet paths to try and flank enemies, and the Hypershot especially is useful since some parts of some maps are destructible. It's incredible how ahead of its time this game's multiplayer was. At one point, there was even a planned kill streak that would drop in a giant mech to wreak havoc on the enemy team. Now, that idea ended up being probably a little bit too ambitious because the PS2 simply couldn't handle that and thus it was cut, but even still, Ratchet & Clank 3 almost beat Titanfall to the punch by over a decade. I'm just saying, Ratchet & Clank, Apex Legends, it'd be a pretty good fit, good brand synergy, Pathfinder's a robot, that's pretty cool. I was fortunate enough to be able to play some rounds back on the PS3 before those servers went down in 2018, and although it was a bit different thanks to a number of bugs and exploits being tweaked or removed, and although I wasn't that great since only 50 people really still played the game at that point, and they were all folks who played the game since the PS2 games, either way, Siege Mode was still a blast. Not many multiplayer modes since have captured that lengthy back and forth and that feeling of a true war of attrition, probably for good reason, but still. After all of these detours, we can finally return to that third Obani moon. Yeah, remember that? Where after a short and sweet gravity-based section that even calls back to Ratchet & Clank 1, we'll find that Courtney Gears has kidnapped Skid and turned him into a robot on the set of her music video about committing genocide against all organic life. That's horrible, but if nothing else, I can respect the brand synergy. After Ratchet takes down Miss Gears, the now robotic, life-hating Skid is transported safely back to the Phoenix, and Ratchet & Clank rendezvous with Qwark near the last known location of Nefarious' ship. It's a trap! Oh what, come on, the game's already copying so much from Star Wars, I'm allowed to do it too. Somehow Qwark sneaks past all of the security and leaves it for us to fight because, hey, more combat is always nice, but as Clank foreshadows, this ship is actually set by Nefarious to self-destruct. Captain Qwark stays behind to try and retrieve something important, and Ratchet waits as long as he can for Qwark to show up, but with time running out, Clank ejects their escape shuttle, leaving the villain-turned-hero to die in Nefarious' trap. After a somber funeral on the Phoenix,
the man was a hero, brave, honest, kind, and humble to the core.
What a load of bullshit.
Big Al gives Ratchet the fourth and final episode of the Captain Qwark Vid-Comics series, which Ratchet plays to get an idea of where Nefarious might attack next, and that would be the city of Metropolis. Actually, it's kind of funny, I'm not gonna lie, because Al immediately pops up with a cranky help desk reminder to play the vidcomic not 30 seconds after sobbing while giving it to you. Jeez, dude, I'm going, give me a second to get there. For as weak as this second act can be thanks to all of that back and forth runaround and the maybe kinda sorta starting to stagnate combat, Metropolis brings us to Act 3 with an absolute bang. For one, rather than drag out the reveal that Clank has been brainwashed or something, we get a cutscene on the way to Metropolis that shows Nefarious revealing to the real Clank that Ratchet's been none the wiser while working with a Nefarious-built evil imposter of Clank named Clunk. That's already a good enough start, but even better is that unlike Blackwater City, Metropolis is a full, proper level, not just a multiplayer ranger level, and more importantly, it looks and feels like the same city that defined the energy of Ratchet & Clank 1, and really as a result, the entire franchise. And after invoking that feeling of being right back at home in a classic level, Ratchet 3 jolts your system early into the level when Nefarious unveils the Bio-Obliterator, a giant Death Star that turns the entire planet's population one by one into subservient robots. All however many billion creatures, even the Tyrannoids that already worked for the Doctor to begin with, instantly under his dominion. Nefarious isn't just another Drek who has a great plan but happens to end up one planet ahead of Ratchet & Clank every step of the way. He's not a Captain Qwark who also has a plan but tends to stumble the whole way with execution and everything happens to work out for him. He is a villain's villain. He's actively been leading Ratchet & Clank astray from the moment he first appeared, feeding the Q-Force into his traps, even if those traps may fail somehow. It's sinister, and it's even more of a gut punch that Nefarious actually succeeds before our very eyes, not off-screen, right in front of us. And after you get to this Bio-Obliterator scene, every Tyrannoid that you'll see from here on out is a robot, even if you go back to previous planets to clean up titanium bolts or skill points, or for whatever reason you may have. And although that sounds like such a minuscule touch, swapping the enemy textures quickly after a certain triggering point later on in the game's story proved to be a monumental effort, to the point that the game's PS2 discs had to be printed again and again and again as tests with some of the data on the innermost part of the discs to figure out a configuration where the game would load everything fast enough between planets and not crash. This act of moving data around and printing test discs again and again and again and again 1,700 times is another one of those hacky tricks and smart corner cuts that made this game work despite pushing the PlayStation 2 well past its limits, and it's these platform-specific tricks that would prove troublesome later, although not directly for Insomniac. Yes, it's probably about time to pull that band-aid off and talk about the Ratchet Clank Collection, a PlayStation 3 port of the original trilogy of PS2 Ratchet titles, developed by a studio at the time named Idle Minds. The studio, not long after this project, adopted the working name Deck 9 and is now at the helm of the Life is Strange series. Thanks to so many of these little hacks and cheats that Insomniac worked with constantly across this trilogy, Ratchet's always been a bit of a pain to work with unless you were using an actual disc on an actual PS2. Even playing Ratchet & Clank via hardware emulation using a PS2 disc on one of the old fat PS3s caused problems. Emulating them was awful until relatively recently, and even then there are some issues with shadows on some of the games if you do choose to emulate. Trust me, we'll get there next time. A best case scenario still would have made these games a pain to remaster, and this dozen or so member port team had nothing close to the best case. Insomniac's archiving process, just by virtue of its crazy development schedule, hadn't been that great during the PS2 days, meaning that to begin with, Idle Minds had to rebuild much of the trilogy's asset database from the ground up. Since these sorts of HD collections and remasters aren't exactly well budgeted, and since Sony supposedly at this time had a weird policy about what a remaster's developers were permitted to change from the source, Idle Minds was left a bit handcuffed. On top of that, somebody at Sony Computer Entertainment wanted Idle Minds to rebuild Ratchet 3's multiplayer with a new online server structure, and to top all of that off, despite giving an initial fall 2012 release date both privately and publicly, for reasons that have never been given, Sony bumped the collection's release date up, in Europe only, to June, cropping 2 to 3 months off of potential polish work. Keep in mind that none of this is factoring in the downloadable version of both the whole collection and each game individually. Each of these two would require slightly different tweaks to account for all of those little tricks that Insomniac used. 3 whole games on one single Blu-ray can't all share the same spot on the innermost part of a disc to load the game and the assets more quickly, but Idle Minds could allocate data in a different and possibly faster way when a game was bought separately from the other 2 on PSN. All of the tricks, all of these things that made these games work on PlayStation 2 are exactly the same things that led to these ports sometimes being broken, and it's frankly a miracle that Idle Minds was able to keep the damage mostly to visuals. The end result here is that Ratchet 1 more or less came over totally fine since it had the most time that went into it. Going Commando ended up with a couple visual issues, such as the weird, oversized floating helmet during cutscenes, but is otherwise fine enough, and Up Your Arsenal got the worst of the trilogy, both thanks to the multiplayer requirement and the shorter time frame. Which, I guess, is fitting, given that that sentence could also describe the original version of Ratchet 3. Now, I would love to give you some first-hand verification of all of this, or the direct story of why these ports struggled so much, but sadly, the team at Idle Minds responsible for this collection comprised fewer than 12 people, and they're all just about ghosts. After hours of searching every lead I could find, only one of them had any online presence whatsoever, and any attempts I had to contact these developers or the studio directly were met with no reply. So until somebody can reach these folks, my decade-long quest to try and get answers about this port's issues comes down to a combination of my own recollection of the release date fiasco and the suppositions of a couple former Insomniacs that worked on the original trilogy. I actually remember first coming across Mike Stout and Tony Garcia's developer Let's Plays back in 2012 when I was first doing some of this research, so in a weird way this rough port is heavily responsible for this retrospective even being a thing, let alone being so thorough. And also, funnily enough, if not for these ports, rough as they may be, and without Idle Minds having done the legwork to rebuild Insomniac's archive for Ratchet 1, Insomniac may likely not have been able to reuse the exact level meshes in 2016's reimagining of that first game, which means that that game would have looked much different too if not for this HD collection, but we'll talk about that when we get to that game. Moving back to Metropolis here, this tends to be one of the more challenging levels in the game, as the new robot Tyrannoids take more damage because of that built-in armor, and they pack more of a punch because... robot bullets? It's a massive leap tonally from the rest of the game thus far too, with the Biobliterator looming in the horizon, floating around as it presumably converts more of the city into robots. For once, you really feel like Ratchet & Clank failed, like you failed. You really have to earn your victory on this one, but when you do, you get another 1-2 punch of awesome boss and awesome Ratchet 1 callback. On the very same trains that acted as a set piece in the first Ratchet & Clank, you'll take on Giant Clunk, because of course Nefarious made sure to give him a giant form. Why wouldn't he? He's the biggest fan of Clank in the universe. The fight isn't exactly hard per se, since he's mostly just throwing the same bombs with shockwaves that most bosses throughout the series have had, but it's a system-pushing sight to behold as Giant Clank flies between the front and the back of these parallel trains, with the city flying by behind you. During moments like these especially, man, you just can't get better than this with a Ratchet game, or with a PS2 game in general. And even once you've saved Clank and destroyed Clunk, that feeling of failure still lingers because Nefarious's plan completely succeeded. Clunk was disposable, the entire city of Metropolis is in shambles, Captain Qwark is dead. It's just about as bleak as Ratchet can get. You can take out some of your frustration by helping the Rangers clear Metropolis of Robo-Tyrannoids after this if you'd like, but otherwise, all you can do is admit defeat and regroup at the Phoenix. And you know what? Credit again to writer Brad Santos, because the game makes sure to straddle the line between the situation's gravity and still bringing in a little bit of levity.
Our demographic research indicates that robots will make up 100% of the galactic population by this time next week. Of course, that's great news for my re-election campaign because, as you know, I'm half robot myself.
I mean, these are still really weird jokes to make 4 years after the guy left office, especially to your 10-year-old audience, but I guess when you've been working non-stop for 3 straight years cranking out video games, some references are bound to date themselves a little bit. Aside from the usual jokes though, Ratchet 3 tends to keep this darker tone for the entire third act up until the game's conclusion, almost harkening back to Ratchet 1 a bit. Sadly, the rush behind the scenes does peek its head out a little bit at this point as well, and it can take away a little from one of Ratchet 3's shining achievements, its ability to conclude Captain Qwark's character arc. Naturally, it's been obvious that Qwark's not actually dead since, you know, he's been in almost every game since, but for a brief moment back in 2004, there was a chance. You could actually believe it. That moment lasts no more than like an hour though, because it only takes 2 planets to discover that Qwark is in fact alive. After the Metropolis disaster, and with Nefarious' whereabouts yet again unknown, Sasha, now back in control of the Starship Phoenix, sends Ratchet and Clank to the crash site to look for any evidence of whatever Qwark was looking for on Nefarious' crashed ship. Apparently, nobody thought to look for survivors or anything earlier? Okay. The bright side is that this plot point might take longer for some players to discover than others, because fighting your way through this ship's wreckage can be a nightmare if you don't know what's coming. Actually, I lied, that's not really a bright side at all. If your weapons or health are underleveled, or if you haven't purchased one of the more recent sets of armor back at the Phoenix, you can expect a lot of deaths, and a lot of spawning right back at the start of the level. By this point though, you should have more than enough of your weapons leveled up either to max, or at least close to it, and even though using a maxed out weapon is sort of wasting experience that you could be gaining with another weapon, you'll definitely want to abuse your level 5s here. And to be totally fair here, this difficulty spike is understandable with respect to the story. After all, Nefarious packed that ship full of troopers to kill Ratchet, Clank, and Qwark. Well, not Clank since he already had Clank, but I guess he was alright with Clunk being collateral. It makes for a really unique level aesthetically too, so even though I used to hate this level as a kid, it's grown on me over time. And if you look carefully enough when exploring the destroyed hull of Nefarious' cruiser, you'll find the Nano Pack, a really neat piece of gear that stores extra nanotech that you might pick up when you're full on health, and dispenses it if you're ever close to death. While Ratchet and Clank do actually find that Qwark was looking for something, an encrypted data disk specifically, they also find his boot tracks in the dirt and discover that he escaped and took a cab somewhere. Before we can find out what's on that data disk though, the Rangers need help one final time. This time on planet Iridia, another throwback to Ratchet 1. If you didn't know any better, you might think this was meant to be the final game in the series with how much love it throws back at the first two. Iridia also unlocks our final new weapon in the main game, the Quacko Ray, this game's morph weapon which turns enemies into ducks. Later it'll turn some foes into bigger ducks that'll fly around you and dive bomb into enemies, and the rest of the ducks will shoot out fiery exploding eggs. Kazooie, eat your heart out. After trekking through multiple missions on yet another multiplayer map, including one mission where you're tasked with assassinating several Tyrannoid generals, which, if you ask me, is pretty brutal messaging for a Ratchet & Clank game, the Rangers reward you with this game's token last-minute gadget that's only used once, the Warp Pad. Yet another casualty of time in this game, the Warp Pad was initially a glove-based gadget that would let you teleport anywhere that you could throw a warp point. So imagine Ratchet 1's bomb glove, except anywhere you could throw a bomb, you could teleport. Since the idea of teleporting would have been easy to work into the game, everybody involved put it off for a while to work on more important things, and then realized when it came time to implement it that, oh, dear god wait, can you imagine how easy it would be for any player to break the game or get out of bounds and softlock themselves, and if Sony finds any sort of out of bounds softlocks, they won't let us release this game until it's fixed, oh dear god. So instead, the Warp Pad was cut back in scope immensely and can only be activated now on specific warp points, of which there are only a couple, and only on our next level, Qwark's secret hideout, which Ratchet & Clank discover thanks to a secret 5th Qwark Vid-Comic. The Captain's secret asteroid hideout is mainly notable as one of the few multi-path levels, with the optional path giving you a Gadgetron PDA, fitting considering Qwark's side gig as a PDA salesman in Ratchet 1, and also because it has the third and final Clank section of the game. Conveniently, Scrunch the Monkey is hiding in a briefcase in the middle of this random asteroid too, because Clank wouldn't have gotten far without him. The level itself is another one I'll chalk up as just fine. It's mostly combat as usual, this time against hundreds of Terminator-styled Qwark robots. The main reason to push through at this point is that at the end of this level, we get the catalyst to what I would argue is Captain Qwark's final piece of character development in the entire Ratchet series. Even though he's been in almost every game since, often prominently, he gets pretty badly flanderized after Up Your Arsenal, and that's a shame, but it does make sense. See, one of the strongest facets of Ratchet 3 to me is that it pays off the fact that this trilogy, at first completely unintentionally, is more of a story arc for the Captain than it's been for our titular heroes. When we first meet Captain Qwark in Ratchet 1, he's a past his prime wash-up trying to cling to any money train he can. In Going Commando, he's so driven by his need to be that hero, by his need for the fame and adulation, and maybe a bit by revenge, that he'll rig a galactic crisis just to save it. And in Up Your Arsenal, when he's had the chance to truly redeem himself, he comes so close to that redemption, only to tuck his tail when his life is in danger. We've seen Ratchet go from idolizing him as a younger kid to making his life's goal revenge on Qwark, to laughing him off as some buffoon, to, in some small way, trusting and maybe even respecting Qwark in this game. And many players will feel the same way. Yes, he's obviously the actual villain of Ratchet 2, and that's a bit inexcusable for the character, but when push comes to shove here in Ratchet 3, he does the right thing. His horrible plans somehow end up working perfectly every time, and they're always spot on even if they're drawn in crayon. The Q-Force that he handpicked is actually a pretty competent squad despite looking ragtag, and even though he recognized his mortality and fled from it, he actually was trying to help save the galaxy in the moments before Nefarious' ship self-destructed. So for him to turn away from everything that he's done, from all of that progress that he made, that actually hurts, not just the characters, but us a little bit too. It's in this moment that we're a little bit of both Ratchet and Clank, frustrated yet again that Qwark's awful narcissism would bring him to do the wrong thing even in the face of doing what's right, but because it's a kid's game, still confident that at the end of the day, Qwark will come around and, as Clank says, be the hero that he's always wanted to be. We've got to leave Qwark alone to sulk for now because we've got more pressing matters to deal with. When Ratchet gets back to his ship, he finds out that the Phoenix is under attack and the crew is in imminent danger. What ensues is another kind of harrowing level where we fight our way with a handful of Rangers through our home base, our safe haven, the Starship Phoenix itself, to rescue our friends. If the game was going to have a hub, it had to have a hub defense mission, and this is some perfect execution. Except I'm not sure why they went with the robot ninjas. That feels a little bit off. It's a shame then that what would have ensued on this level was meant to include a full space combat encounter, where Ratchet would dogfight his way around the Phoenix Star Fox style, taking down enemy dropships and robots trying to breach the outer hull. However, space combat, for reasons that to date haven't fully been explained, were cut entirely from Up Your Arsenal. Until today. Today's the day to change that because I spoke with the programmer tasked with working on those space levels. Considering that space combat was featured in both of the first two games in some capacity, its absence here is pretty loud, and there's absolutely a bit of a hole left behind when the game, aiming to be bigger than its predecessor, had to crop back multiple features that were present in that predecessor. This game, after all, features almost everything that the previous games did as part of that goal of being bigger and better. We have spherical worlds with their own custom gravity, we have Giant Clank, and there's even a spot in the Phoenix where you can purchase ship upgrades. Since there's no space combat, it's limited only to colors and aesthetics, but that the cosmetic store made it into the game without the accompanying gameplay has always been odd to me, even since I was much younger. And even though almost every other piece of cut content from Ratchet & Clank 3 made it into this game's Insomniac museum, including the scrapped racetrack in a semi-playable state, the space combat was never even mentioned. That's in part because, according to designer Mike Stout, the space gameplay never made it past the dev kit, and thus never made it onto any of the early builds nor any of the 1,700 discs that had been burned during Up Your Arsenal's development. The space combat was at least playable, but it was early enough into development that it never had any proper art made, nor was any art implemented. Stout, who I'd like to note was not responsible for designing the space levels in Ratchet 3, recalled to me that these sections were meant to be similar to the on-rails Star Fox-esque sections that later appeared in the PS3's Ratchet & Clank Future Tools of Destruction, and this sounds similar to the concept that programmer Tim Trepich described to me as the programmer that was tasked with bringing Ratchet 3's space combat together. Trepich described a style where you would be chasing a string of enemy ships through an asteroid belt in a circle, and later another design where you'd be flying up and around the Starship Phoenix, fighting off attackers during the ambush later in the game. When I showed Trepich a clip of the Tools of Destruction space gameplay, however, it apparently didn't look quite like what he was tasked with making based on the designs that he'd been given to work with years ago. To Trepich, and apparently to others within the studio, the on-rails sections just didn't seem good enough to show Sony during an early demo showcase, or that good at all, really. Trepich was given a month to turn the space combat around, a design in which, remember, he had no say as a programmer that had to answer to the designer, and the pressure certainly didn't seem to help. This, he told me, was the third time he'd been given such an ultimatum during his 3-year stint at Insomniac. Just under a month later, Trepich made it clear that he couldn't make the prototype work in the time he was given, and he departed the company not long after. that this was allegedly the third time he'd been told in no uncertain terms, make this work in a month or else, had me very concerned about what's been, for most of my life, my favorite game developer, the crew that consistently released games that I enjoyed more than most anything else. And again, I want to make it clear that at no point throughout this retrospective have I personally insinuated that excessive crunch occurred. I've only referred to crunch when directly talking about an employee's words either to me or to the public. Many of the ex-Insomniacs I spoke to leveled the crunch pretty evenly compared to their other employers before or since in the industry. Nothing too bad necessarily, just about what you'd expect near the end of a project. Likewise, there's a strong chance that this retrospective will receive testimonials in the comments from other Insomniacs with whom I didn't speak. After all, even with all of my research, there are more than 90 people that I couldn't reach that worked on this game, and I had blind spots where I couldn't obtain interviews, such as the multiplayer crew, the Idle Minds remaster team, artists, management of course, etc. And some of these people may very well vouch that Up Your Arsenal's development was more or less fine. But crucially, that's from their perspective. Especially across different specialties, developers will invariably have their own experiences during production and with management, and just as invariably, their own experiences cannot discount others. We've heard stories of people being called back in late at night because something with their work went wrong, and stories of programmer Tony Garcia staying at the office and working for 72 straight hours to clear up his bug list, and these stories started to concern me more and more with every thread on which I tugged. When I asked Garcia about that 72-hour crunch period, he made it clear that nobody at Insomniac had asked or pushed him into doing that. It was something that he did, in his own words, entirely on my own for some pretty dumb and misguided reasons at the time. And importantly, he noted that when somebody higher up noticed, they stopped him right away. That bug crunch, according to Garcia, didn't even make much sense when looking back because they weren't in any final stretch to finish the game or clean it up, and the game would have been just fine if he hadn't done that. But this is where the development team's relative age and experience is crucial. As Garcia noted during our conversation, he was only 3 years into his employment at Insomniac, and even though he was so new relative to some of the folks who had worked on Spyro, he was in some sort of position to set an example for many new hires that had come in between Ratchets 1 and 3. While Garcia didn't say this part to me directly, the Snow Beast Award came to be specifically because of how many new hires complained to him about the Snow Beasts that he had worked on in Ratchet 2, a situation where fans are talking to the artist directly about his work, except those fans aren't just fans anymore, they're colleagues. If you're this fresh, young developer eager to prove yourself in a competitive industry working at a studio that made one of your favorite games just a few years ago, and you see those same developers working day in and day out, you follow in those footsteps. One of the former Insomniacs I spoke to who worked on multiple projects told me that they worked 12 plus hours a day on weekdays, and on top of that, an additional 12 plus hours over both days on their weekends, effectively working 7 days a week for their entire multiple-year tenure at the studio. According to this former Insomniac, they were given a small salary increase at one point during their time there, which placed them just above the threshold at which they were no longer guaranteed overtime pay for those extra 40 hours a week. Now, if you came in and you saw that as a new worker, you might not know, you probably wouldn't know, about the alleged avoidance of paid overtime. You would just see somebody working incredibly diligently every single day and think that's the normal here, without knowing that that person was going through hell every day. And if you overheard CEO Ted Price say that if you're not working weekends, you might not have a future at the company, as one former Insomniac recalled to me, guess what? That's the normal to you, and you'll want to step up to stick around, and you'll want to work weekends to stick around. And if you saw people sneaking in little hacks such as printing discs in a specific way to load those Tyrannoids robot textures on earlier planets, or a workaround to patch the game's multiplayer on a console that did not allow for patches by writing updates into the buffer space underneath Sony's end user license agreement, that's the normal to you. You work up to that level. And if you saw the fancy new tech being worked on for Resistance and wanted to somehow work it into this less advanced project, like, say, reworking the pathfinding for the Battlefield missions, that's the normal to you. You, as a new employee at Insomniac, would be surrounded by some of the cream of the crop of the industry, by people like Ted Price himself that stayed long hours or worked overnight to get more work done even though they may not have been asked to, or the people that actually were called back in late at night because something went wrong, as one Insomniac recalled to me. You were part of a team so determined to ship the absolute best title that they could, in spite of everything that went wrong during development, that you likely took part in the crunch culture yourself because the management both set a poor example and didn't stop it when it occurred. Whether Insomniac's crunch was any better or worse than the rest of the industry, that seems like it may depend on what the person's role was individually at the studio, but it was there. None of these games could have come out if not for crunch. Crunch was, and this is me speaking here, professional opportunities be damned, crunch was factored into the time budget of this franchise for years and years. That is a fact. That is an undeniable fact. This is a game defined by the ambition of those who made it, and I can't help but feel a game occasionally, ever so quietly, tormented by it. This game was supposedly a disaster in the weeks leading up to release, with one Insomniac employee expressing fear that they were going to be responsible for Insomniac's first critical failure. This game, Insomniac's highest rated game to this day, was a butterfly's wing flap away from possibly being the worst and potentially, as a result, the last Insomniac game. That does not happen without crunch. And this is the trade-off with Up Your Arsenal's ambition. A more directed and frankly better written story led to animators supposedly having to crunch to finish the story scenes. A more focused gameplay approach finally allowed Insomniac to put together the character action game they'd been looking to make from the jump, but because platformers were really starting to go out of vogue during the PS2 era, they actually betrayed that very template of shooter-platformer hybrid that they set as a goal. The constant barrage of enemies allowed designers to better balance the weapons, especially now that those weapons could be upgraded multiple times. But almost all of Ratchet 3's variety as a result is either weapon variety in a game where 7 of the 20 guns are standard weapon tropes and 5 more return from previous games directly, leaving only a few that are outright really new, or a variety of combat situations, since secondary features like racing and space combat ended up being cut partway through development due to either a lack of time and resources thanks to the issues that arose from the multiplayer, or simply because they weren't turning out to be that fun. Because there was arguably a lighter variety, some fans felt from the jump that Up Your Arsenal was chasing that high that was going Commando, but struggling to keep up with it after years of current developers pushing so hard just to keep these games churning out. And the irony of that variety, thanks to all of this, thanks to the animation team being behind, thanks to the story treatment aiming to save artists the time by cutting back on the number of unique enemy creatures, is that there's less of a variety of enemies in the game where you're fighting enemies the most. And the thing is, despite how this all may sound, I love that this game has that combat focus. In the moment when you're playing it, Up Your Arsenal is an exceptionally paced game that masterfully puts together all of what Insomniac had learned from the first 2 Ratchet & Clank games. There is constantly something to look forward to right around the corner, whether it's a crazy new weapon or a twist in the story or an interaction with a fan-favorite character. I love the perfected feedback loop of upgrading your weapons, that satisfying feeling of feeling a weapon get progressively more powerful as you shred hundreds of enemies per level. I love that weapons now give proportional experience when enemies are defeated, rather than all of that experience going to whichever gun dealt the killing blow. I love that right when I might start to get bored of the more linear level design, that's the exact moment that we're told to revisit the arena, or that we're given a series of ranger missions on a wide open battlefield. I love that as weapons level up, they automatically gain the bonuses from Ratchet & Clank 2, like the Acid mod or the Lock-On mod, rather than forcing you to buy them with secret collectibles that you might not find in your first playthrough. I love that for as linear as its main level design is, Up Your Arsenal is the first game where every level is designed from the outset with secret areas in mind for bonuses like titanium bolts or this game's new collectible, Trophies, No Relation. Where in the first two games gold/platinum bolts weren't as planned and instead just thrown into random areas that playtesters had accidentally found, here you're guaranteed to have a number of those little eureka moments more often per level. When I'm sitting down and playing the game, I'm laughing at the jokes, even though I've heard them all countless times by now. I'm enjoying the story, I'm having a blast. I love all of the optimizations of Ratchet & Clank Up Your Arsenal. But maybe fittingly given the game's title, there's always a but. I love the constant intensity of the combat in the moment, but when I step back, I wish we could have seen some more of those little platforming sections that ended up being set aside as a result, rather than those being segmented to just the arenas or the Vid-Comics. I mean, this game doesn't have a single grind rail, despite those being one of the easiest ways to bring intensity without needing another gunfight. I love Insomniac's efforts to throw in more strategic weapons, but I personally don't find much use in ones like the Infector or the Hollow Shield because they're a bit too situational for how enemies usually come at you in this game, which is head-on. And to stretch this even beyond just this game itself, I love Dr. Nefarious. He's an incredible character, and in this game at least, is the perfect combination of intimidating, formidable, and funny. As much as he's used for laughs, Nefarious is a tragic villain in this game, a dude that was mercilessly bullied by our sort of hero, Captain Qwark, a perfect foil for Qwark's 3-game redemption arc. But I'd really love for him not to have become a bit of a flanderized crutch for Insomniac to use in later games. And I'd have loved if his crazed evil scientist plots didn't just devolve into I want all heroes to lose. That's not the fault of this game, of course, and I can't blame this game for that, but it's something that I think about now when I play Up Your Arsenal, knowing the context that the rest of the series provides. And I love that Qwark by the end of the game has his come-to-Jesus moment, that he finally gets to be the hero that he's always pretended that he was, that he's always wanted to be. But I wish that the conclusion to his character arc didn't mean that he would reset and retread from here on out. Especially now that his voice actor Jim Ward has retired, I'd like to say that Qwark's character deserved better than being just the buffoon for the last 15 years since Up Your Arsenal concluded his story. And to throw one more butt out there, I love the next level, partly because it's named the Nefarious BFG, partly because we can get the plasma coil starting on this planet and that thing just shreds everything to bits, and partly because it's the easiest place to farm bolts and break the frame rate with how many bolts come flying at you, but it's just straight up filler. At the end, Clank uses the BFG to destroy the Bio-Obliterator, only to discover immediately that a second, bigger Bio-Obliterator is already finished and ready to go. Eat your heart out, George. Nefarious doesn't even need to wait for his second Death Star. That's not it though, this is a double butt. We already knew that there were multiple Bio-Obliterators. The game told us immediately. The characters already acknowledged multiple Bio-Obliterators. Why is this a surprise now? It's a really odd and really rare moment where this game drops the ball with its story, but it means that we can jump right to Qwark's true redemption during the final assault on Nefarious. After Ratchet and Clank fight their way through a lengthy onslaught, pushing through corridors with waves and waves of robo-tyrannoids guarding every doorway behind every piece of cover, after taking down Nefarious...
That's right, Nefarious! Your reign of terror is finally...
Okay, after a fight through even more of Nefarious' robot troops and across a war-torn battlefield and past a giant destroyed Clankhead, which is that's pretty strange, actually. After the Galactic Rangers show up and absolutely demolish the last troops in your way as a thank you for all of Ratchet's help. And after an amazing fight against Nefarious, dodging his dozens of doppelganger attacks, jumping past his shockwave bombs that he throws in a staggered pattern so that you can't time your jumps formulaically, running past his anchored laser attack thing, Nefarious arms the Bio-Obliterator, which goes into... arms and legs mode. Let's not think about it too much. They were already out of time, and they were out of memory in the level, and they'd just blown their load on making that Nefarious fight so damn good, so they admittedly half-assed the true final boss. But it's here, with no possible way for Ratchet & Clank to win except either swerving around pretty easily in a figure 8 pattern and just holding down circle, or just shooting this giant Death Star with a sniper rifle a few times. Again, let's just pretend, okay? It's here that Qwark makes his grand return, flying in his ship to distract the Bio-Obliterator and give Ratchet a fair chance to fight. And it's thanks to Qwark's help, it's thanks to Qwark's redemption, at least if we pretend that he actually did anything during this past fight, that Ratchet and Clank are able to defeat Nefarious, with the Doctor and his butler teleporting to some space rock 10,000 years away from any planets just before the Bio-Obliterator self-destructs. And with that bang, and a live screening of Clank's newest Secret Agent Clank film, featuring almost all of the characters that we've interacted with over the last 3 games sitting in the crowd, we end our story, and we end the Ratchet & Clank trilogy. I could talk about the challenge mode in detail or the new Rhino 3, but as with many facets of this game, they're both pretty similar to what we already saw established in Going Commando. The Rhino in this game acts like a combination of the first 2 Rhinos at first, before eventually just becoming a screen-clearing weapon like Going Commando's Zodiac. I could talk about the Insomniac Museum some more, but aside from a few secret minigames hidden inside that really aren't all that noteworthy, it's very much an evolution of the very same museum that we saw in Ratchet 2. Ratchet & Clank 3 to many people acts as the pinnacle of this franchise, but to many others, it's just acting, and they make a strong case that this game is more of a case of iteration than innovation. But at the end of the day, do these buts matter? Does it matter that this game feels like it has less variety than Going Commando did? Does it matter that the game was so close to collapse thanks to this top-down overambition at Insomniac, or that dozens of Insomniacs were undeniably afflicted with heavy crunch at points throughout the project, enough that despite this team being so young and so excited to be here, many of them were out of the company, and some even out of the industry within a couple years of Up Your Arsenal's release? Yes, I cannot lie, all of these buts matter. And they matter because if there's anything we can take from these buts, it's that Insomniac has been more open than you might expect from a game studio regarding the subject of crunch, and that the studio has learned lessons from these games and from their own ambition, if sadly not immediately. In this game's post-mortem write-up, Brian Hastings noted that in response to this project's management failures, the studio had begun improving its training practices in each department at the company, and that it aimed to improve its prototyping and planning from the outset to avoid running into issues with scope anywhere, be it cinematics or side modes. It's worth noting that the incredible struggles with this game's online mode didn't come from a place of malice, it came from a genuine underestimation of what multiplayer design might take. But these failures would serve to improve the online multiplayer for future Insomniac titles like Ratchet Deadlocked and the entire Resistance series. Other realizations took a bit longer to hammer home. It wasn't until the postmortem for 2006's Resistance 1 that an Insomniac higher-up acknowledged the so-called star developers that would step up and bring a project together, and even after struggling with hiring and training during this project, those struggles continued well into the first PS3 Ratchet game that came out a year later, Tools of Destruction, when they were still hiring and training people on this project just 3 months before it shipped. Budgeting time for animations continued to be a struggle even as recently as 2016, but through each of these issues, the studio seems to have openly audited itself and admitted when it failed. Crunch is a dirty word in the games industry right now, and yet the main times that I've used it throughout this retrospective have been in reference to when Insomniac's third ever employee used that word himself to describe developing Up Your Arsenal. And yet, the crunch on Resistance wasn't as bad as it was on Ratchet according to that game's postmortem, and the crunch on Tools of Destruction, based on my research, hasn't sounded as bad as the crunch on Resistance. Even as development costs have skyrocketed and projects have bloated more and more in scope, nothing came as close to the sun as Up Your Arsenal did, and Insomniacs, both former and current, seem to have taken from that experience and used it to improve themselves and their projects. Even the former Insomniacs that I've spoken to that left the games industry entirely in part because of this project loved their time working on the game. They just wanted it to be a bit better managed. Does that passion from these former employees, that lamenting that they loved their work, just not the hours, excuse Insomniac's management for allowing a toxic culture of overworking to breed? Absolutely not, and some part of me can't look at these early games in the same light because of that. But these failures provided at least some of the framework for Insomniac to get it right, to grow past the culture of just a handful of dudes working on a Doom clone in an apartment, to mature and catch up to the company size that ballooned perhaps faster than the management could handle. And if Insomniac's been about one thing besides crazy weapons in these last 15 years, it very much seems like that thing is project management. So I'd like to think that even if they almost certainly haven't solved the issue entirely, because frankly almost nobody has, hopefully they've gotten closer. Regardless of your opinion on whether this game reached Going Commando's level of quality or fell short, it's because this game fired a shot even further out than Ratchet 2. It's because it pushed way too close to the sun that future projects didn't crash and burn, even if this one singed countless feathers along the way. Regardless of if you're like me and never played the original PS2 version's multiplayer online, and you'd rather have had a more robust single-player experience rather than compromising even a little bit, there's another world out there where Ratchet 3's multiplayer is somehow looked at in the way that Halo 2's is in our world. And regardless of how, when I think of Up Your Arsenal, so much of what I love is followed by the word but, or how maybe I did want slightly more variety, or how I occasionally missed that exploratory vibe of the first two games, or how I wish some of the later games didn't keep chasing at what made this game lightning in a bottle for the third year in a row. Without those buts, the rest of the series would likely have been developed under worse conditions, with more employees burning out or worse, breaking down. Over the last few years, whenever I've tried to sit down and write a script about this game, to write out my thoughts, I couldn't get myself past that word. But, because there was always a but at the end of my praise. But now, thanks to the developers that I've spoken to, the stories that I've heard, the stories that I've told, and the ones that maybe I haven't yet, I'm glad the buts are there. But, that said, I'm never doing a video this long again. See you for the 14-hour Deadlocked retrospective. Until then, as always, stay golden. This video was made possible thanks to the generous support of my Patreon backers, including Goldstorm07, Vincent, Harry, James Boss, Terminally Nerdy, Wolf Chaoson, and Buckles Chucklow. If you'd like to help support the Golden Bolt and future videos, you can do so at patreon.com/thegoldenbolt. Thank you.